let me bring up the Paul Finebaum show here. This is something it's just weird to say that we're going to be listening to the Paul Finebaum show here. But to start things off, I'm going to play you a clip from Kirby Smart when he joined the Paul Finebaum show last week. Listen in.
Your recruiting record at Georgia, and even prior to that, was unmatched. And as you talk to players, I'm interested because they usually want the same things. They want a good education, they want to play football, but they're also thinking about what happened last night and tonight.
Oh, absolutely! It's a great sales piece. What gets me, Paul, is you probably. Well, let me rephrase that. You probably would believe it, but you wouldn't believe what some coaches outside our conference tell kids. You know, they'll sell to a kid. It's better to not go to the SEC because it's too tough. It's too competitive. It's too physical. You might get beat up. You might get banged up. You might not have as good a career there that you will somewhere else. Well, that's not the way the NFL GMs are looking at it, and that's not the way the NFL coaches are looking at it. They want to take kids that want to compete at the highest level, that want to go play in those big-time matchups, and that's what the kids want. They want to go play in the biggest games in the biggest places, and that's what they aspire to do. So for a coach in maybe another conference to sell that, hey, it might be a little easier path to come over here and go this way, it just speaks volumes. You want kids to be able to see through that.
Well, I'm a little bit surprised by that, but it's pretty obvious and evident outside of, and I'm not going to name the schools, but they're pretty obvious and evident who they are. Outside of two or three, it's not working.
No, it doesn't. But those are sometimes the ones you're competing with.
Well, yeah.
Wow. So that's a clip from the Paul Finebaum show. Now, during the show, Paul didn't ask specifically of Kirby Smart who he was talking to, or talking about, rather. However, later on in the week, he made an appearance on Birmingham-based 94.5 FM radio show The Roundtable, and here is a clip from that.
Paul Finebaum with us on the Jocks Roundtable. Friday on your show, you had Kirby Smart on. And I was blown away by one of his comments. We hear about, people talking about Nick Saban's age on the recruiting trail, or this or that. You can't go to this school and play because they've already got 5 people at your position. But Kirby said on your show Friday that other coaches are recruiting against the SEC by telling them it's too difficult in the Southeastern Conference. You'd have an easier schedule and look better on tape playing in a different league. Do you know who he was talking about? Was that a shot at Dabo?
This is an opinion. Let me make that clear. But yes, it was a shot at Dabo Swinney. And when as he was saying it, I thought it was pretty obvious that it was, because he was talking about recruiting, and I'd have to go look at the transcript. But it left no doubt he was talking about Dabo Swinney because of the proximity in the recruiting battles. There's no one else that could be in consideration because Ohio State would not be doing that based on their recruiting prowess. And I really, if you go outside the SEC, who else really matters? Clemson is the only threat to Georgia outside the SEC for most players. So I don't think he really left much to the imagination. And it was toward the end of the interview, and he had to go do another interview. Otherwise, I may have tried to, be a pesky reporter. But that's who I thought he was talking about.
Wow. So some more interesting development from the Paul Finebaum show, and then Paul Finebaum himself, who he did say it was his opinion, but he did feel like that Kirby Smart was talking specifically about Dabo Swinney, and we all hold Dabo Swinney very close to the heart. So I wanted to talk about that as our first segment of the night and bring Mark Childress on to talk about it as well. A few things that I thought was, of course he's going to be talking about, the one of the schools that has been having so much success and only an hour and a half or a little bit under an hour and a half away. I'll pass it over to you, Mark. What do you think about his comments a couple of days ago?
Yeah, I guess I was taken a little aback by them. I mean, Georgia likes to run their match. So I spent almost 20 years down in Georgia, before I moved back to the upstate a couple of years ago. So I am very used to Georgia fan in the off season, and Kirby was very much on brand for that, right? It's always next year is our year, and they're going to talk bad about everybody else. So it doesn't surprise me. I think Kirby's kind of playing it up to the base, firing a shot across the bow at Clemson. He can do that this year, right? Because more than likely the teams aren't going to play unless it's in the playoffs. Let's see if he's as brave about calling out Clemson after the upcoming season when he knows he's going to be kicking off with them in Charlotte to start the 2021 campaign. I bet you're not hearing this kind of stuff from Kirby then.
And Al, what do you think? Is this a big deal? Is this shocking to you as a longtime Clemson fan and Clemson grad yourself?
No, absolutely not. I've heard a lot of Paul Finebaum and a lot of his nonsense. He seems to do everything he can to rile up Clemson fans, and he does a good job. I mean, Clemson fans love to hate this guy. He's actually probably one of the most hated people by Clemson fan base, which is shocking. But I mean, the fact that he just spews the SEC nonsense and the Alabama nonsense, he attacks Dabo and that kind of thing. It is what it is, and I don't blame Clemson fans for not liking the guy at all. I'm not so sure he's right on this. I don't know that he was talking about Dabo Swinney necessarily. And even if ACC schools are using that as a ploy to get recruits, it's not dirty. You're not saying anything that's not true. The SEC has been the best conference overall for many, many years, plain and simple. As a whole, if you're looking back at a decade, they've been the best conference. They have the highest quality teams and the most teams at the top. Now, some of that, I do think their ratings are inflated sometimes in the rankings. They're all listed preseason top 10, so how can they, drop out of the top 25 kind of thing? But I mean, I think they have been the best conference overall, and I'm not ashamed to admit that because Clemson's been one of the best teams as well, and they've been bringing home the titles. That's all I care about. It doesn't really matter to me if ACC schools want to get a recruit by saying don't go to the SEC. It's a harder conference. Who cares?
Yeah, and I know he mentions another thing, too, the fact that Clemson is the only threat to Georgia outside of an SEC team. Now, there's a lot of teams that we could talk about, like your Auburns, Alabama, Tennessee, Florida's of the Southeast area that are definitely big-time threats to Georgia. And I'm going to mention a few other stats, too, but if you look at it, outside of the SEC, I mean, you could probably say that about Alabama. Who's Alabama's biggest threat outside of the SEC? It's not Memphis. It's more than likely going to be Clemson. It's not Tulane. Okay, so more than likely going to be Clemson. It's definitely right now not Florida State. Maybe 10 years ago it was Florida State. Maybe we'd be able to say that. They probably would have that argument where, Florida State's not, it's not Florida that's biggest rival. It's or recruiting threat. It's Florida State. So now they're just moving on to Clemson, who's the big dog of the ACC. And that's really, to me, he's trying to knock Clemson by saying that Dabo Swinney is going out or the Clemson coaches as a whole are going out and saying, hey, save yourself. You can get a higher draft pick if you just play for the ACC. Mark, do you think that is the case? Do you think that the ACC coaches in general are saying, hey, come to us because you don't want to get beat up in the SEC?
Well, a couple of them might be. I mean, I don't think it's a great way to recruit, but it doesn't mean that that's not beneath some other coaches that are out there. I mean, there is a talent discrepancy between the SEC and the ACC. I mean, we just saw that in the NFL draft last week, right? And, the SEC broke all kinds of records for number of players taken per round. LSU broke the record for number of players drafted off of one team. I mean, there's a big talent discrepancy. It just depends on whether or not you feel like that has as big of an impact on a team's ability to make the playoffs or not, right? I mean, you had two SEC teams make the playoffs a couple of years ago and meet in the championship game. It hasn't happened since then. Hopefully it won't happen going forward. But there's also some really bad teams in the SEC. And you look at the SEC East, and I know it's improved a little bit, but if you look back at the SEC East for the last 5 years, I mean, it was Georgia. Who did Georgia have to get through, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you can make fun of the ACC Atlantic all you want, but Georgia didn't have to play anybody to get to the SEC championship game, and even didn't do it in some of those years, right? Florida did it instead, and they were not a very good football team. So you really got to ask the bigger question, right? Is the talent in the SEC, is that really, quote-unquote, wearing these teams down during the season, whereas Clemson's able to stay fresh because they're not playing quite the talent level? I don't really buy anything or put any stock into that, but I know a lot of people do.
Yeah, me personally, I don't buy it because, I mean, the team as a whole, if you look at like a wide receiver, the wide receiver's only going to go up against the defensive back. Now, more than likely, yeah, I mean, you look at, say, Justin Ross, he's going to go against, let's say he was at an SEC team, for example. More than likely, he might have 4 teams that are going to have some pretty decent defensive backs on it, but Clemson has been playing SEC teams too. So they play in South Carolina, they're playing Georgia's, they're playing Notre Dame's of the world, and then they're getting into the playoffs and playing Jeffrey Okunda and Damon Arnett, who are both top, I believe, first round, second round picks from the Big Ten. And so Clemson is doing what they need to do to scheduling wise to play the schools that are out there. Now there are 1 or 2 players on every team that is an elite level, but there's going to be times where players in the SEC are not playing, the best competition in the world. The SEC doesn't always play the best competition in the world. We talked about this, Mark, when we were on the Roar a couple of months or last year, really, before the season started. We talked about Alabama's schedule and how it really wasn't that scary looking for anybody, really. I mean, when you go up against, I believe it was Western Carolina or whoever, you're not really going to be that worried about, or you're not facing an elite defensive back at that point. And like I said, just because there might be an elite offensive line or an elite defensive line doesn't mean the wide receiver even comes in contact with them in the game. So I think there's a lot of variables. You can't just say that it's because they have all the best NFL draft picks. I mean, the SEC, if you think about it, is a large part of land. I mean, it goes from Texas A&M, right, all the way to Gainesville, and I mean up to Kentucky. I mean, that's a large area of land to cover. And then Missouri, Arkansas, all of the South. And the South has typically been where your big time football players come from anyway. So I think they benefit from where they're at, but that doesn't mean that other players on other teams outside of the SEC are just having a cakewalk. And that's something that gets frustrating every single year. Now listen to this too. And I wanted to point this out because Kirby Smart needed to talk about recruiting specifically. I went and looked up recruiting final rankings. Now, this is from Rivals, I believe, the final rankings that I got here. So far, since 2017. So 2017, Ohio State, because Paul Finebaum mentioned Ohio State. He said he can't be talking about Ohio State because they're the other powerhouse outside of the SEC, and they're a recruiting powerhouse. So they don't need to use that language of just come to us, right? He can't be talking about Ohio State, so he must be talking about Clemson. Well, if you look at it, I mean, he's right in that sense. 2017, number 2 overall class. 2018, Ohio State, number 2 overall class. 2019, 21 overall class, but there were some changes there. 2020, number 5 overall class. And so far right now, 2021, number 1 overall class, right? You look at Clemson, 2017, 22 overall. 2018, 8. 2019, 9. 2020, the 2nd overall, and 2021, well, it could be 1st overall, depending on where you're looking. And then 2021 right now, currently sitting at 5th overall. Georgia, on the other hand, listen to this. 17, 3rd, 18, 1, 20, or 19, 1, 2020, 1. 3 years in a row, number 1 in recruiting. But 2021 right now sitting at 14th. So on average, 6.2 for Ohio State, 4 for Georgia, and 9.2 for Clemson. But Kirby Smart seems to think that it's important for him to take a shot at Clemson. And this is where Dabo Swinney comes from, little old Clemson, making all these problems, causing all these problems. But, these teams are out recruiting him. And then I think Kirby Smart's a little bit upset in the sense that he's had 3 classes in a row that are best in the nation. And what does his trophy case look like? What do you think, Al?
Yeah, I agree 100%. I don't buy the whole, like y'all were talking about earlier, the whole getting beat up thing, playing in the SEC. All that's nonsense to me. The fact of the matter is the year Clemson, just trounced Alabama in the national championship 44-16. Alabama didn't take a game that year that I remember hardly into the 4th quarter. They were up by, 3 more touchdowns on everybody all year. So they weren't getting beat up by anybody. I mean, they could have taken their starters out and let them rest if they wanted to, or do whatever they wanted. That was an evenly matched game of 2 great teams, and then Clemson wipes the floor with them. So get out of here with the they get beat up nonsense. Okay, that's just a garbage argument. And I mean, look, the recruiting rankings are interesting. You've been talking about that, and Georgia's been number one the last few classes. And the one thing you got to take, the fact that Clemson recruits really, really well. I don't want to say they're getting out recruited. They may not have the highest recruiting rankings necessarily, but a volume, is one of those things that a lot of those kind of things take into place. The rivals of the world, the ESPNs of the world, they give you more credit for more recruits. Who always has more recruits than anybody else? The SEC. Okay. They oversign every single year. That's a very common thing that they do. And they cut bait with some of the lesser talent or whatever it may be. That's just something that goes on all the time. And it's something that Clemson doesn't do. So yeah, they're going to be recruiting at a higher clip, most likely. And the fact that Clemson offers so few guys, they don't have a chance to get as many of these guys because they're not throwing out offers to just anybody. Look at the offer list. That's a good stat to pull up, is to pull out how many offers Clemson has out there for these next couple classes, 2021, 2022, and how many offers these other guys have out. I mean, they have 2, 3, 4, 5 times as many offers as Clemson does right now. So you cast a wider net, you're more likely to get more of these players.
And what do you think, Mark? I want to pass it to you. We talked about the recruiting rankings. Alan made a great point about the fact that just because the number out there is higher than Clemson's doesn't mean Clemson has less or been out-recruited in the sense because of the types of recruits that they're getting. They are landing some big-time guys. But is it interesting to you, Mark, that Georgia, who seems to be having no problem being getting back-to-back number one classes overall, is kind of complaining in a sense?
Yeah, it is a little bit. I mean, Mark Richt had some great, recruiting classes as well. So I think there's a coaching gap right now between Clemson and Georgia. I think there's a gap on offensive game plan. It's a massive one. I mean, Georgia's been running the same offense, it feels like, for the last 20 years, right? Student body right, student body left. And they've got to get into the new age of football. And it sounds like with some of the changes that they're making, they've got a good chance of being there. I put a little bit more stock in the argument if you wouldn't have looked back at the last 5 years of the playoffs. If Clemson would have gone into the playoffs and just gotten smoked in the semifinals every year, I don't know, like Oklahoma or somebody like that, then I would put a little bit of stock into the talent differences and how big of an advantage it is for Clemson and things like that. But Clemson's won 2 national titles, and they beat SEC teams to do it, right? They beat an Ohio State team that people are saying might have been the best Ohio State team ever, or at least in the last 10 or 15 years. They beat Notre Dame, blew them off the map. They beat Ohio State again, Oklahoma. I would put more stock in it if Clemson were getting to the playoffs and underachieving every year. And maybe their path is a little bit easier to the playoffs than Alabama's is. But, who's Alabama going to play this year? I mean, LSU's going to take a step back. Auburn's had a bunch of coaching changes, and, those guys are bipolar, and you never know. So, again, I don't put a lot of credence into this. I've long learned to ignore the Georgia fan base. That makes things a little bit easier for everybody.
Yeah, I'm glad you learned to ignore them as well. I've got a couple of them. And look, I have the only Georgia fans I know personally are wonderful. Okay. I have a couple that go to church with me. I have one that is a close friend of mine, and they are all great. But you just hear these horror stories about Georgia. How crazy their fan base is and the fact that they bark at you. I've mentioned that in one of our top 5 lists a long time ago. That was a lot of fun. So it's not a fan base that I'm just endeared to by any means. And I've always pulled against them, and I let these people know that I care about very much. Hey, I love you, but I don't pull for Georgia, nor will I ever pull for Georgia. And of course, you get the same stuff, from them. Oh, everybody has those type of fans. Yeah, you're right. Everybody does have those type of fans. Georgia just has more than everybody else.
Well, I've got some family members or a family member that went to Georgia, and so I try to not beat them up too bad. But when a head coach comes out with something like this, it's kind of hard to ignore. We originally didn't have this in the lineup to talk about at all, but I was kind of like, wow, this is amazing to see. Like, this coach is so upset about Dabo Swinney, and really, if you think about it, I mean, it doesn't not make sense. I mean, like I said before, he doesn't have Florida State to complain about, Miami, North Carolina, Louisville. But I mean, and even Paul Finebaum mentioned that Gene Chizik was kind of confused because, I mean, at the end of the day, Gene Chizik could say at Auburn that, it's Clemson is their biggest rival, right? I mean, or biggest recruiting problem. And like I said, Nick Saban could say the same thing. So I don't really get it, but I kind of understand it from just kind of trying to take a jab. And, maybe he's kind of hurt too because Tennessee is really catching fire in the recruiting trail right now. We're going to talk about that later on at the night. The last section of the night, or last segment of the night, we're going to talk about Tennessee and should Clemson be worried about how Tennessee has been doing the past week in recruiting, because they've been doing very well. And I've got a list of the guys that they landed and kind of look back at the last couple of seasons or last couple of recruiting classes and got some interesting notes for you. So hang tight for that later on in the show. But again, Mark Childress was joining us for the show for the first segment. Thank you again, Mark. You got anything before we let you go, my man?
Well, you can catch the Mark Childress Show on Facebook every Friday at 7 o'clock. We've been having some, great Clemson guests the past few weeks. We had C.J. Spiller a couple of weeks ago. We had Bradley Pinion last week, which was great. So we're trying to get somebody else teed up for this Wednesday night. So every Wednesday night, 7 o'clock, the Mark Childress Show. And gentlemen, it's always a pleasure to be here with you. Thanks for the invite.
Thanks for watching this video, and make sure to join our live show every Monday night at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time right here on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss it.